Welcome to Allegories and Dystopias Reading Science Fiction. This week we begin our analysis of the TV show Black Mirror, and we'll be looking at three specific episodes, though of course you're welcome to watch more than just those three. But I want to spend some time explaining the concept of an allegory for those of you who might be unfamiliar with it, and also to talk a little bit about dystopias. And in that vein, I will also discuss utopias, and I will discuss in a little bit more detail heterotopias as they are defined by Foucault. And that will kind of provide a little bit more context for what we were doing last week with the blog post in analyzing and using the social network as a way to analyze how Facebook might be functioning as a heterotopic space. Though I do think whether or not it is actually functioning as such is up for debate. So I will talk more about that later on in this lecture. I do say that this is reading science fiction. Black Mirror is a TV series that is sort of fits the genre for science fiction. Although one of the things that I invite you to think about is how fictional is it really? How much of our science fiction out there can we even really deem fiction anymore? So having said that, if we think about what an allegory is a literary or rhetorical device. It can be a story, a poem, a picture, a TV show, a movie, but it's meant to be read for its deeper meaning, and typically those deeper meanings have something to do with our moral or political structures or beliefs. And so we really want to be looking at everything as a symbol in an allegory. One of the most famous allegories is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. It's possible that at this point in your life you've been exposed to this allegory in some way or another, and if not, now it has happened. This allegory deals with the way that we learn. And it sort of addresses our nature in that we sometimes prefer ignorance. Of course, we've all heard that saying, ignorance is bliss. And that it can be kind of hard when we are drug out of the darkness of the cave, so to speak, out of the world that we're used to and into the seemingly harsh light of the sun, and forced to recognize things that we didn't know were there before. And this allegory has been reworked in a number of different ways. Probably one of the most well-known. The Matrix kind of functions in that way, the movie The Matrix. I think that we can read this episode of Black Mirror, 15 Million Merits, as an allegory for present-day society. So we will be addressing that question in this week's discussion forum. But as for the Allegory of the Cave, if you watched the two lectures preceding my own, then you understand the way in which it deals with this concept of educational violence, and the way in which it's sort of making a comment about how human belief becomes human knowledge, and what the distinction is between those two things. And also it raises the question of doubt and the importance that doubt plays in the learning process, but also how important it is to recognize our own ignorance. So that doubt can be good, but we have to also acknowledge that we don't know everything, and that there are a lot of ideas out in the world and structures at play that we may not be privy to, and that the older we get, the digger we deep, the more we look into it, we start to recognize these things. And it has the power to shake us and to scare us, but also, again, to enlighten us and to make us more evolved, I guess, for lack of a better word, humans. So I'd like you to keep this allegory in mind. And just remember that as you're watching Black Mirror, think about how the elements of an allegory are present. So allegories are typically narrative in that they're going to tell us a story of some kind. They're deeply symbolic. So all of the characters that we're presented with, the setting itself, the plot, these are all meant to be read beyond the surface or superficial meaning of the story. So for example, with Black Mirror, sure, it's a story of boy meets girl and boy has feelings for girl, and but it's not merely a story about that. So it's important that we work to understand what all the symbols are referring to within the allegory. And while an allegory like Plato's Allegory of the Cave might be tougher because we're not in ancient Greek society, we have to work a little bit harder at sort of breaking down the symbolism there. Black Mirror should be pretty easy to break down since it does reflect what's going on in our world right now. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys have to say about that. Now, utopias and dystopias, these are imagined places. Okay, so this is again what makes these places different from a heterotopia. These are simply imagined places. But these places permit us to explore social and political structures that are at work in the world. Utopia, this is from the Greek words, eu and topia, and of course that means essentially no place and good place. And utopian literature tends to explore the structures of the good society, societies that are above and beyond our own contemporary society, so much better than we are. And so it often raises questions about perfection and what is perfection, and how can we be better people. And a utopia is often unattainable, yet it can be very morally instructive. So as Foucault says, utopias are sites with no real place. They are sites that have a general relation of direct or inverted analogy with the real space of society. They present society in a perfected form, or else society turned upside down. But in any case, these utopias are fundamentally unreal spaces. So I'm going to use that as kind of a segue to just sort of break down heterotopias in a more specific way. And in part I'm doing this because I'm getting ready to post my own response on the Impossible website that kind of synthesizes all of your responses. Like I want to speak to the things that you guys posted in your analyses, as well as kind of put out my own, or in terms of whether or not Facebook really is a heterotopia. And I'll be touching upon that a little bit here. But Foucault breaks down the heterotopic space according to 6 different principles. And so I've just kind of bullet pointed these principles for you here, and I'll briefly talk about each of them. And I'm also going to go ahead and post his lecture of other spaces on our Blackboard site. So those of you who haven't already taken it upon yourselves to read it, if you are interested in reading it, you can. Of course, it's not required. It's just there if you feel like exploring the idea a little bit further. All right, so the first principle of a heterotopia is that heterotopias are found across cultures. So every culture has some kind of other space outside what we'll call the hegemonic space of society, and that just means the sort of mainstream political and social structures and places that are in play. However, even though we will find heterotopias across cultures, we will not find them in any single universal form. And Foucault talks about crisis heterotopias, which are most common in primitive societies, where we see these spaces manifest for the privileged, or for the sacred, or for the forbidden. And Foucault argues that we are actually indeed losing this particular type of heterotopia, the crisis heterotopia, in our contemporary society. So he references things like boarding schools in the 19th century, or military service for young men. He talks about women who are menstruating. These are society considers, especially adolescents, to be people who are in crisis, and they need a space in which they can experience that crisis. And so some societies will construct, if they are really into fertility, then women might have a sacred space in which they can menstruate, but it will happen outside the sort of normal space of society. And it's important to understand that there's the public space and the private space, but the heterotopia is still an other outside of those two. And this is where it does get tricky if we're arguing about whether or not Facebook is a heterotopic space. Because I think what's happening with Facebook is that it's blending those spaces, the public and the private. But more on that later. All right, so again, the first principle, we can find heterotopias across societies, but we will not find them in any one single form. I think in today's world, nursing homes are still a pretty obvious, concrete example of a crisis heterotopia. Okay, so you can keep that kind of in mind. The second principle, and this is taken directly from his lecture, is that a society as its history unfolds can make an existing heterotopia function in a different fashion. And so Foucault gives us the example of the cemetery, and in his speech, he does a semiotic analysis, essentially, of the cemetery and how the placement of the cemetery within a society, within the actual construction of the city, reveals the ideologies about death that were prevalent at the time. Okay, so by analyzing the change in function and the change in location of a heterotopic space, we can see into the ideology or the shifts in ideology that occur within a society. So he talks about how cemeteries used to be at the center of cities with the churches, and that as time has worn on, cemeteries have now, when cities are constructed, cemeteries are typically on the outside of the city, and this has to do with the shift in ideology, where once death was associated with the ascension of the soul, and this was very sacred and important, and so therefore it was housed at the center of communal life. And then as time has worn on, and now we know we're in this age where death is sort of considered a disease, and we don't really want anything to do with it, we've sort of moved that heterotopia outside of the city, on the fringe, if you will. Okay. The third principle states that the heterotopia is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place several spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible. And Foucault gives us the example of the theater. He says the theater brings onto the rectangle of the stage, one after the other, a whole series of places that are foreign to one another. Thus it is that the cinema is a very odd rectangular room, at the end of which, on a two-dimensional screen, one sees the projection of a three-dimensional space. He goes on to explain that the oldest example of this type of heterotopia is the garden. And he talks about the Orient. In the Orient, the garden had very deep and seemingly superimposed meanings. And gardens are often considered sacred spaces. And again, there's sort of this sense of a rectangular form, these four parts representing four parts of the world. And then in the center of the garden, there might be a fountain that represents sort of the source of all life. And so all these sort of different spaces that otherwise don't come together in this heterotopic space. So in a sense, it's a way of making sense. And perhaps, again, the garden is, we do see gardens across cultures, so this kind of goes back to principle 1. The fourth principle is that heterotopias can be connected with specific moments in time. And this can deal with either the accumulation of time, so we would see this in the heterotopic space of a museum or a library, and it can also be concerned with the flow of time. So if we consider things like festivals that are very free-flowing and transient, transistory, if you will, that they're sort of oriented toward the eternal, but also they can also be oriented toward the temporal. The fifth principle tells us that heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. So what does Foucault mean by this? He explains that a heterotopia is not necessarily freely accessible like a public space. You can just walk into a public square. Whereas a heterotopia typically has a compulsory entry. So think about spaces like prisons, where you are compelled to go to them. Or the individual has to submit to rites and purifications. There's some kind of permission, and certain gestures have to be made in order to enter that space. So again, this sort of raises the question of, is Facebook a place that requires this of us? Do we have to submit or make certain gestures in order to enter there? Is it a place where some kind of purification happens? And of course, I don't necessarily mean in the religious sense of rites and purification, but is there something like that happening there? All right. And then finally, the sixth principle. This is the one that Remarchik relies upon most for his analysis, that Facebook is a heterotopia. This is the one that states that the last trait of heterotopias is that they have a function in relation to all the space that then remains. And this function unfolds between two extreme poles. Either the role is to create a space of illusion that exposes every real space, all the sites inside of which human life is partitioned, as still more illusory. Perhaps that is the role that was played by those famous brothels of which we are now deprived. Or else, on the contrary, their role is to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is, messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled. All right, and here he gives further examples of colonies and again, brothels and colonies. Okay, so there are things that go on there. He says that there are two extreme types of heterotopia. But then he does use a lot of metaphor to explain this concept. And so there's the metaphor of the mirror, which Foucault argues is both a utopia and a heterotopia. But perhaps I think the best and most illuminating metaphor that he gives in his lecture is that of the boat. He says the boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea, and that from port to port, from tack to tack, from brothel to brothel, it goes as far as the colonies in search of the most precious treasures they conceal in their gardens. You will understand why the boat has not only been for our civilization from the 16th century until the present the great instrument of economic development, and then he has parentheses, I have not been speaking of that today, but has been simultaneously the greatest reserve of the imagination. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations without boats, dreams dry up. Espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police take the place of pirates. All right, so again, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and post the full lecture for you, but I think that giving a little bit more concrete examples to this idea of a heterotopia and helping to better establish the difference between a utopia and a heterotopia, and finally a dystopia, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, will be helpful for sort of reflecting on why we were talking about Facebook in that way to begin with. And like I said, here sometime over the next couple of days, I'm going to write up my own response and I'll post it so you can take a look at that. So to wrap up this lecture, I just want to talk a little bit about dystopias. Naturally, this is the opposite of a utopia. So if a utopia is concerned with a perfect society, a good society, and it's a morally instructive text, a dystopia deals with an unpleasant or frightening society, okay, a very bad society. It usually features totalitarian rule or extreme environmental degradation. The environment is just annihilated, or dehumanization of some kind. And dystopias are often used in texts in order to draw our attention to real-world issues that are of great importance. So again, I think we will see, and especially when you read Terry Murray's article, Black Mirror Reflections, She makes mention of this episode of Black Mirror, and I think kind of all the episodes of Black Mirror function in this way, where they are simultaneously dystopic and allegorical. And so we want to use our powers of analysis to really break down the symbolism that's occurring there, and how are these things representing, how are these symbols representing our current society. All right, so I'm looking forward to your responses for this week. And please, as always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.